Hi everyone, welcome to the debating and judging briefing for WUDC Belgrade 2022. Let's start with who we are. So this is the judge score. We've got Miloš, Enting, Juanita, Jan, Brent, Hadar, Nolu, and myself. You can reach us at Ask CA or motion clarifications on Discord. Please remember, don't personally message us, don't inbox us on Facebook or Discord or anything like that. We cannot guarantee we'll be responding, and if we do see your message, all we're going to be doing is redirecting you to those channels. So please put any questions you have relating to the ad score or the motions in the relevant channels on Discord. So 10 things to note about debating and judging here. The much excited sequel to 10 things I hate about you. So firstly, on the tech policy, please read the tech policy and follow it. It has been sent to your emails and it is available in the #importantinfo channel on Discord. Secondly, join Zoom promptly. We will not release the motion until everyone is in their Zoom rooms. So please join as soon as you get that notification. Thirdly, for judges, let us know about changes in your availability in the #availabilitychange channel on Discord. And please make sure that we have acknowledged your message before you leave. If you do not let us know, we will assume you've done based on the availability you originally put in, and we don't want to be missing judges than what we're expecting. So let us know about your availability changes. Second thing, disconnect policy. Judges who disconnect cannot vote, but they can participate in the discussions for the sections that they have heard. I want to make it clear here that if, for example, you have heard the opening half, but then drop out during closing government, you can participate in the opening half discussion. You cannot participate in the closing half discussion or any other comparisons that involve any other teams. And you also cannot vote in any vote. That means you cannot vote even in the opening half split that you were present for. You can only participate in that discussion if you have dropped out. So this information is also available in the tech briefing. You can pause the video here to read it if you need to. I won't go through the whole thing or read it out to you, but it is important that you have this available and ready to go during the debates. Number 3, feedback. Feedback is extremely important, especially for close calls. Breaking judges, chairing judges, and progression for out rounds will be heavily influenced by feedback. So it is important that we have accurate and lots of feedback. So we encourage written feedback as well, especially if you're giving a low numerical score to a judge. We want to know why. Tell us what was wrong. Was it the oral adjudication? Was it the call? Was it the feedback? Tell us what was wrong. And please refer to the judge feedback scale that is available in #importantinfo when submitting the feedback. It is really important you don't use your own guide or your own thoughts. Use the standard setup we have in the feedback scale so that everyone is consistent across the tournament. Fourth thing, cheating. Please don't cheat. It is against the rules and you should not be doing it. If there is something you don't understand, you can ask only your teammate or the CA team. And if you ask the CA team, you should be asking it in the relevant channels on Discord. Don't private message us on Facebook or Discord or ask in the Zoom. Ask on the Discord channel. You should prep only with your partner. No other partners, teammates, coaches, family, friends, pets, etc. Only your teammate. And what is absolutely not allowed is any internet research, any communication with anyone that is not your teammate, so your coach, your friends, etc. Cheating is a breach of the rules. Absolutely, please do not do it. Number 5, points to information. You are encouraged to take at least 1 POI per speech, and judges should track and evaluate POIs as they would any other exchange in the debate. And a failure to accept a POI indicates a reduced level of engagement, and judges may do one of the following: lower speaker scores, adjust the margin of victories, or flip close calls between teams. POIs are in the rules. Just because we're online doesn't mean you should not be doing them. You should absolutely be offering them and taking them because it will impact results. Number 6, counterprops versus alternatives. So opposition teams is not required to provide an alternative. However, they may choose to provide a counterprop or an alternative if the motion type allows for a policy. So a counterprop must be advanced by the leader of the opposition. It must be mutually exclusive to opening government's model, and it must alter the comparative of the debate, and it binds CO. So CO has to follow what is set up by OO. An alternative has no fiat power, And there could be a range of viable alternatives instead of one single solution, and it does not alter the comparative or bind CO. So it's important that you remember the difference in how you're using them in the debates. Number 7, contradictions. Contradictory claims should not be credited, i.e. if a claim A and claim B are mutually exclusive, teams cannot be credited for claim B. Judges should also evaluate the extent to which the contradiction has undermined the team's persuasiveness, i.e. claim B could have caused claim A to become less persuasive because it identified the contradiction between the arguments. And judges should not credit opposing teams unless they point out that contradiction. Number 8, there's no such thing as an automatic fourth. There is always a worse team. There's always a worse argument. There's always something worse that can happen. Number 9, teams do not automatically fall out of a debate if they are unresponded to. Maybe they're just being unresponded to because they're very good and no one has rebuttal. You should assess the arguments themselves anyway. And 10thly, and lastly, accent or rephrasing is not the same as adding value to an argument. You have to actually look at the substance of that argument and whether or not it has meaningfully advanced the argument that's being made. All right, that's the 10 things wrapped up. Let's quickly go on to the speaker and judge briefing for the first part. There are a couple of different motion types you'll see at this tournament. You'll have policy motions, this house would, which involves doing something. Analysis motions, this house believes that, this house supports / this house opposes, this house prefers a world in which, this house regrets, this house prefers X to Y, this house believes X should, which are all motions that are empirical or judgment motions, and then also actor motions, which is sort of a combination of the above two from a different perspective. So this house as X actor would do what the motion says. So policy motions, this house would. For example, this house would ban cigarettes. We are the parliament of a country. The question of the debate is whether or not we should enact this policy and whether or not we should do it. Government has the fiat in assuming the policy will pass. Everything past that point is up for debate about how well it will be implemented or how it will be responded to or whether it will have harms and benefits. But the government has a fiat to say it will actually happen. You can't make an argument from op to say the government would never ban cigarettes because the motion gives that fiat to the government teams. Analysis motions. This house believes that, this house supports, this house opposes, or this house believes, yes, sorry. So in all these examples, we've got things like this house believes that pride parades do more harm than good to the gay community. This house supports or this house opposes Donald Trump, for example. The question is whether or not the statement in the motion is true from the perspective, importantly, of a neutral observer. It is not a debate on whether we should ban pride parades or ban Trump. It is a debate assessing the value of those things. You don't need a mechanism, but you still need to define the debate. For example, we've got here is a metric to do more harm than good, or a metric as to why you would support or why you would oppose the things in the motion. Other types of analysis motions. This house prefers X over Y. For example, this house prefers euros over WUDC. We would set prefers Australs over WUDC, but that is an unbalanced debate because obviously Australs is better. The question is whether or not the statement is true. So op has to compare Y to X. They can't squirrel away from that. They have to do the opposite of what government says. And also op cannot invent a new item to compare to. So they can't say, for example, that heaven is better than both euros and worlds. They cannot also prove an abstract of like X is greater than Y, therefore Z is greater than X. That's meaningless. It doesn't mean anything. It's just algebra. You have to actually engage in X and Y as the positions and as the clashes in the debate. Another type of analysis motion, this house regrets. For example, this house regrets the rise of hookup culture. What we're doing in this motion is asking whether or not the world would have been a better place without the existence of the thing that we are regretting. We have the benefit of hindsight in these debates, so we can look back and we know what happens going forward, but it's important to remember that you need to describe how the alternative world would look. For example, we can't assume that without hookup culture, all people will be in a long, meaningful relationship. We would have to actually prove that alternative to be true in order to make a stance in the debate. Yet more analysis motions. This house, I apologize, an actor motion now. This house as X. In this debate, you are looking at the debate from the perspective of X. So you have the values, knowledge, and interests of the specified actor. For example, this house as the United States would intervene in Syria, or it could be something like this house as a parent would not send their children to a private school. A really common mistake is thinking that a motion, this house believes that X actor should, that is not an ACTA motion. For example, this House believes that parents should not send their children to private schools because you're assessing that from an objective perspective. An ACTA motion is not an objective perspective. It is the perspective of a parent in the example that we've given here. And principles are still relevant in this kind of debate. Now we've got another analysis motion. This House believes that X should, which is different to what we just talked about. So in this House believes that the USA should invade Syria. As I said earlier, this is an objective perspective of a neutral observer, not from the interest of the USA. And even though it is phrased as analysis, there is a policy implemented in this debate. So we do expect some kind of definition, for example, what kind of invasion you would support in this motion. Info slides. Info slides and word definitions will be given at this tournament when necessary to clarify terms and concepts. Any information in an info slide is assumed true and is an indisputable fact about the debate following it. You can add additional information provided it does not contradict the info slide. And you should ask the CA team for clarification if necessary, again, using exclusively the hashtag motions clarifications channel. Definitions, policies, and fiat. You should debate the level of generality of the motion. So many different status quos in many different countries. Do not assume that the motion isn't status quo. So, assume the motion isn't status quo. This House would ban alcohol. In that motion, you would assume that alcohol is not currently banned because the motion is that you are banning it. Unless said otherwise, the debate is taking place within a functional democracy. That is not necessarily a Western liberal one, but it is one that is functional and working. More on definitions, policies, and fiat. What can't you do? You cannot place set or time set a motion. You cannot limit the debate to only special cases. So e.g., if a motion was this House would ban private cars, you can't model you'd only ban the Peugeot 206. You also cannot advance a mechanism that is not within the spirit of the motion. That is called a squirrel. What can you do? You can define a detailed mechanism to implement the motion, and you can enter caveats into that mechanism. Proposition has fiat though. Assume the motion can pass, and there's no arguments about Parliament or Congress and whether or not they would actually pass the policy. Definitional challenges. The vast majority of debates are defined legitimately. Very, very rarely will you see a genuine definitional challenge in a debate. The standard you want to use is the definition a reasonable interpretation of the words in the motion? How to challenge. You want to explain why the definition is unreasonable. You want to propose an alternative definition with justification, and you should still engage in arguments that are based on the original definition. So if you're going to challenge a definition, you are now having 3 different debates. So make sure that you are genuinely serious about the fact that someone has messed up a definition before you attempt to challenge it and engage in that disaster. Counterprops. Op teams can propose a counter policy or a counterprop in order to achieve the same outcomes as government teams. Counterprops must be mutually exclusive to the prop case and will alter the comparative of the debate, and they must be advanced by the leader of the opposition. They cannot sneakily come out at 5 minutes 30 in the deputy leader's speech. If advancing a counterprop, OO has fiat power to the same degree as opening government does, so you cannot magically fix every problem in the world just with your counterprop, because that would be an imbalance of that fiat power. Alternatives. Opposition teams sometimes suggest a range of viable alternatives without committing to one single counterprop. These alternatives do not alter the comparative of the debate and do not bind closing opposition, which is different to what we just talked about. OO has no fiat power in advancing alternatives, and the feasibility of these alternatives can be challenged by the government team. On extensions. Extensions can be a number of things. Explicitly new argumentation, new layers of analysis for arguments that were already introduced in the top half. They could be new rebuttal, framing, criteria, defense for criteria, and weighing new arguments. Closing teams, however, do not win through just minimal additions to already well-established points, but to the extent which their contribution, including the summary, is meaningfully better than what has come before. As a judge, you should identify what was new and then compare to openings material when assessing that comparison. On whips, there are no new arguments in either whip speech, gov or op. A new argument is not the same as new examples, new responses to ideas read in the previous speech, new framing, or new weighing. So those things are allowed in whip speeches. New arguments and new matter will change the traction of the original idea that was presented in the original speech. I will now hand you over to the next member of the Ouch Corps.
Okay, everyone, now for the judges' briefing. We will start with the average intelligent voter, that creature oft speculated about, rarely seen. A few things to note about the average intelligent voter. The average intelligent voter has no specific knowledge of a country, profession, etc. This would be anything that would be too particular or expert in nature. They are willing to be persuaded, non-interventionist, and in terms of views and knowledge only, not capabilities. So just to break down a couple of those things really quickly, willing to be persuaded basically means that you are not really to hold any of your previous beliefs or perceptions about the world against the debaters who are debating in the round. Non-interventionist means that you should not be making claims or inserting yourself in the debate in a number of ways. And again, this is really just about knowledge and views, not capabilities. So you have to fully understand the rules, obviously. You are not less capable of understanding complex concepts necessarily, and you're not less capable of logically following and analyzing the debate. So this is what we mean when we talk about the average intelligent voter. Now, we also need to keep in mind that when we judge on a holistic basis. So judging on a holistic basis means that you, apologies for the music outside, follow the logical flow of the debate with the following principles. So first, be comparative, right? Making sure that we're dealing with what the world would look like in contrast to what the other side is proposing. Keeping in mind that there is no such thing as an automatic fourth. Someone speaks for a minute and a half, or someone tells a joke about a sports team that you particularly like. There is nothing in debating that gives you an automatic fourth. That's one of the most important things to remember. You need to bear in mind the main points of the clash in the debate and decide which teams have provided the best justification for it, which team has provided the best justification for its bench to win. So this is what we mean when we talk about holistic judging. Here are some things you do not do when you are judging holistically. So you first do not count arguments. It is not sufficient for someone to win a debate by having 6 arguments merely, which overwhelms the 4 that were had by the other side of the debate. You also will not give separate scores for style, sophistication, originality, etc. Just because you found this particular motion interesting, it shouldn't really impact how it is that you're looking at the debate. So judge the debate as it is. Judges should insist that teams engage with each other's arguments as much as possible. There's not any duty to hit every argument from the other side, but major claims which go unchallenged should be counted as conceded by the team which has passed up the opportunity to respond. So basically, like, what we mean here is it's not necessary for a team to respond to every single argument in the other case, right? That's not the way that debating works. We're looking at holistic persuasion, how much you're able to convince the judge on a variety of factors based on what's happened in the debate. But if a major claim, again, goes completely unresponded to, then that's obviously going to impact how persuasive the team was overall. Now, lastly, judges may consider claims to be responsive, even if not explicitly labeled as rebuttal, right? Like, don't let labels and terminology get in the way of good debating. Something that is labeled as constructive could just as easily could serve as good refutation. Similarly, something that is labeled as refutation could just as easily be constructive. These kinds of terminology are good for teaching people debate. It's not necessarily the best way. Always think about how we're evaluating debates. Now, let's chat a little bit about comparative diagonals. So a comparative diagonal is a situation where we're taking into account the fact that top half teams cannot respond directly to bottom half teams, right? It's one of the quirks of British parliamentary debatings. But there are some things that you can take into consideration in these situations. First, POIs and the willingness of teams to offer and accept them, right? If you have a team that is completely unwilling to engage their bottom half, that is going to potentially impact close calls of certain kinds. Also, the quality of engagement with their bottom half, right? How much are they actually interacting with the teams that can no longer respond to them? And then lastly, the robustness, in quotations, of opening case to potential challenges. So insofar as the case was quite good and well developed, that would also play a role here. Judges may credit material in opening speeches, which is implicitly responsive to new material from the closing half. Good front half teams will anticipate claims that will come out in the debate. And sometimes those claims might not even come out until the back half. And it is, in fact, good judging to be able to spot when that happens and then compare teams in that fashion. The judge must not make new arguments for top half teams. They may reasonably interpret and apply existing contributions, but obviously you cannot make new arguments for top half teams, nor can you assume, well, they probably would have made this response had they had the chance. This is, highly interventionist and goes against some of the principles that we chatted about earlier. So moving on from there, let's just chat about rules violations, right? And so far, like some of the rules that we talk about in this format. The biggest thing that you want to do as a judge when there is a quote unquote rules violation is remove the advantage of said violation. Any new arguments in the summary, as an example, so if a whip speaker is giving some kind of new claim, you should essentially pretend as if it didn't happen, right? Just basically act as if it was not said at all and don't count it in the round. Do not additionally penalize them. Do not try to assign some kind of automatic rank as a result. Both of these whip speeches, if they're making completely new arguments, then they should not be counted, and you should remove the advantage of the violation. Keeping in mind that there is, a lot of ambiguity about what constitutes an argument and what constitutes a response. This is a conversation that you should be having as a judge, but in the event, and this certainly happens, where a whip has a new claim, that should not be considered, and you should not additionally penalize them as a result. In these cases, again, do not further penalize teams. We do penalize for actively harming the debate, though. So as an example, if a team provides an unfair definition or squirrels the motion, in those cases, there is a penalty, but again, there is no automatic penalty. It's just factored into the holistic consideration of the debate as a whole. Can't check what slide I was on. Great. So going back into the slideshow here. So chatting a little bit about weighing. So a couple of things to note here. Oftentimes, teams will not simply just disagree about what is true. In fact, that only applies to certain portions of debates. They're going to dispute what is relevant, right? What should be considered, what should not be considered. Judges should decide what's relevant on the following basis. First, what teams agree is true and important. So if both teams in a debate claim that the most important actor in the round is children, then you should probably evaluate some of the clash on how this round impacts children, right? This is something that the teams themselves have agreed on. Second, what teams implicitly agree is true and important. Sometimes without saying directly, we think children are amazing, the results of their arguments might heavily make that clear. If most of their argumentation is about children, it is reasonable to deduce that the teams found that children were quite important. Lastly, what one side has successfully proven to be important. So there will be times in a debate where there are disagreements about what is important. And if there is good enough reasoning given on one side as to why something is important that isn't adequately responded to by the other side, then that's a good way to be able to weigh the clash in the debate. Where the first of these three do not apply, what would the average intelligent voter, not the judge, but the average intelligent voter, take to be important? So that's the way that you should be evaluating how things are weighed. Again, ideally, teams will do this for you in the debate, but In the cases where this is not true, then we defer to our last portion of the slide here. Let's chat for a second about style. Good style comes in many forms, right? It's really important for us to remember as an international circuit, an international community, that there is no one good default manner of style. What people view to be good style in one circuit, or indeed at one school or in one mind, can vary wildly from debater to debater, from institution to institution, and from circuit to circuit. So with that in mind, when assessing language used, you should only assess how much it contributes to the persuasiveness of the argument. Accents don't have any role in persuasiveness, and merely rephrasing arguments, however well they may be rephrased, with no new analysis does not add value, right? What we're looking for here is an ability to present compelling, intelligent arguments, and to do so in a way that is clear and concise, but ultimately it's the arguments that we're looking for here. And if they are clear, concise, and well made, then merely shifting the words around in a crossword-like manner is not going to be what should win you debates, and it should certainly not be what you're rewarding as a judge. Very importantly, we also want to keep in mind how it is that we manage panels. So when managing panels, a couple things that should be remembered. First, quite obviously, you have 15 minutes for deliberation. This, by the way, includes the assigning of speaker points. The chair's responsibilities are as follows here. First, you need to lead and direct the discussion, right? You need to ensure that your panelists are able to share their views and that you are able to also order things in such a manner as within 15 minutes you can discuss the different clashes within the debates and the different comparisons between teams to ensure that you're coming to the best decision possible. This is going to involve both some moderation, ensuring that everyone gets involved here, but also in some circumstances, it will require you to intervene to ensure that not too much time is being taken up, right? If you're the chair, it's your responsibility in mind. You also need to decide on a vote, right? When it comes to voting period, you keep track of who voted in which way and ensure that you are conducting that vote and that there is a decision reached at the end. Lastly, you are the tiebreaker. So in a situation perhaps where you as the chair are in a room with one other panelist, or perhaps there is also a situation where someone disconnected, whatever the case might be, in that circumstances, if there is an even number and there's a disagreement between you know any situation where there's an even number of votes in both directions, the chair would play the tie-breaking vote in that circumstances. Speaker points should be set after the placements, and obviously they should be in accordance with how people did in the round. It is not possible for a team to win a debate and also have lower speaker scores than a team that finished below them in that debate. We do not have low point wins in this format. Again, also make sure that you're following the speaker scale. If there are disagreements, if you're curious about where something falls within that scale, this has been written for a reason, right? Consult the Discord and ensure that you're paying attention to that. To finish off my portion of the briefing here, I'll just talk about delivering the RFD. So a couple things. First, you have 15 minutes, right? Just like you had 15 minutes for the deliberation, you have 15 minutes to give the RFD as well. This is given by chairs, and if rolled in some circumstances, it can be the chair's choice to give this to a panelist. But ultimately, in the vast majority of rounds, the chair should be the one that is giving the reason for decision. Second, an RFD should contain comparative justifications of the placings, right? If I'm in closing government and I placed fourth, I should know why it is that I lost to opening government, why it is that I lost to closing opposition, and why it is that I lost. If there either clear enough analysis as to sure there's some clarity in terms of the judge. I would make very, very clear here that your comparatives should be a device for improvement, but it's absolutely crucial that you separate these things, right? Debaters need to know the distinction between this is why we won and or lost the round based on what happened, and then secondarily, here are some things that you could potentially do to improve. It's very easy if the judge isn't clear for a team to interpret a loss by virtue of them not having said something, right? Which is not, if you're getting to that point, then there's a lack of clarity there, and that can be a problem. The last thing in terms of what an RFD should not contain is detailed feedback to each speaker. You're just not going to be able to do a good RFD and detailed feedback to each speaker within that 15-minute period. And these tournaments need to run on time. We need to keep things going in an orderly manner. The time zones here are going to be more or less friendly depending on where people in the world are from. And so, make sure that if people want detailed feedback, that's something that can be arranged or asked for once the RFD has concluded. Lastly, personal feedback, again, may be given later, and we expect judges to be accessible to give it, but also as debaters, if any of you are watching this portion, be reasonable and accommodating with your judges in terms of the timelines there. They should be getting to it as soon as they can, but especially, if you're asking the CAs, things can get quite busy, and it's important to show a little patience and decorum there, but also for judges, you should be giving this feedback to the speakers when they ask for it. Okay, fantastic. That was my part, and best of luck, everybody.
Hello, everyone. We're going to review now the judge test answers, starting with the true and false questions. The first question was, a team that provided 5 mechanisms to prove an argument should always place higher than a team that provided only 1 mechanism. This is false. We do not judge summing or subtracting the number of mechanisms or arguments a team used, about how persuasive and how substantiated are those arguments or those mechanisms, implying that if a mechanism is enough for us to understand the claim and that claim is important enough to win the debate, it doesn't matter that another team gave 5 or 6 mechanisms to prove another thing that we did not find relevant in the debate. So, second question, chairs should generally avoid giving below 60 speaker points since low scores make people feel bad and discourage them from continuing to debate. The answer is false. We give speakers scores based on the speaker scale and therefore based on the material the team or the speaker gave in their speeches, not on the fact that they might feel good or bad about the score we were giving them. We should just align with what the speaker's scale is telling us that the speech should be. Question number 3. Member of government provides new framing and characterization to a debate, but does not provide any novel arguments. Member of opposition claims CG has no extension. Member of opposition is correct. The answer is false. There are very different ways of extending in a debate. One of those is adding new framing and characterization, meaning CG has an extension, and what then member of opposition is saying is wrong. Question number 4, a speaker who speaks for 3 minutes can get a higher speaker score than a speaker that speaks for 7 minutes. The answer is true. As I told you in a last question, you have to guide yourself by the speaker scale. You do not guide yourself by the amount of time a speaker spoke. You do not guide yourself by the style the speaker used, or if you thought something better to be had to be said in the round, you guide yourself by the speaker scale and the descriptions you find there. Question number 5. On the motion, this House supports the increasing of U.S. involvement in the Middle East. OG cannot model how U.S. involvement will occur. OG can argue that the U.S. will do it in such way, but that characterization is open to challenge by the other teams. The answer is true. In this House supports motions, OG does not have modeling power, which ultimately means that they do have to explain how is it that the involvement in the Middle East is happening right now through characterization, but that characterization is up to debate and up to to be pushed by the opposition teams. Question number 6. If a team has 2 contradictory claims, the panel should disregard both. The answer to this question is false. You should not disregard both claims. There is a part of the manual that goes over contradictions and how to judge them and how to assess them. But essentially, you should not disregard both. You should regard the one that the team has advanced and the one that the team has said first in the debate in most of the cases, but please refer to the manual to review how to judge contradictory claims. Question number 6, CG needs to explicitly say why their arguments should matter more than the arguments in the OG. Otherwise, they cannot place above OG. This is false. There is no requirement for CG to weigh themselves against OG, even though it's desirable. Judges should be able to understand when an argument is more substantiated or more relevant than another, ultimately meaning that there is no requirement for CG to weigh themselves. It is desirable, it is needed in some cases, but it's not a prerequisite for winning the debate. Question number 8. If CO's rebuttal beats all of OG's arguments, that should be taken into account when deciding between OG and OO. The answer to this question is false. Why is this so? Because when we judge a debate, we go through comparisons in a bilateral order, which ultimately means we just take two teams into account when deciding who wins over the other, and we do not take into consideration other teams in that comparison. But secondly, because we cannot credit OO for what CO has done and proven in the debate. Question number 9. Whip speakers can introduce completely new rebuttal in their speech. The answer is true. This is self-explanatory. This is in the manual in terms of what things can whip speakers do. Please refer to the manual to review this. Question number 10 is the team that wins most of the clashes should always win the debate. The answer for this question is false. Why is this so? Because winning most clashes does not mean you win the most important clash in the debate or the most relevant clash in the debate. As I told you before, debating and judging a debate is not about summing or subtracting what arguments are alive or what clashes are won by a team, but ultimately assessing the persuasiveness and the relevance of the claims made by the team, meaning that a team can win just one clash and lose 3 of them. If the clash is the most important one in the debate, it is fair for them to win the debate. Question number 11. If the debate becomes messy because of the bad setup by OG, the judge should penalize OG for the additional mess in the debate by giving them lower speaker scores. I think we have gone over this a bit already, but the answer is false. You guide yourself by the speaker scale, and the speaker point scale basically describes what each speech should be getting in terms of the content that they are giving in the debate. ultimately meaning that you do not penalize teams. The way you give speaker scores is directly related to the content, to the arguments and rebuttal. The speech has a nod to the fact that the debate was messy because of the speech. You do not penalize teams for this or speakers. Question number 12. An opening government that does not provide a model on a policy motion cannot win the debate. False. There's no thing as an automatic fourth. You have to assess the relevance and the persuasiveness of the arguments advanced by OG, and therefore you cannot say that just because they lacked a model, there is enough reason for them to take a fourth. Question number 13. If opening opposition mitigates 99% of opening government's benefits, this is enough to beat opening government. This is false. Once again, as we already reviewed, mitigating does not mean that one part of the argument still stands, ultimately meaning that you still have to address or assess and evaluate how important are those mitigations, how that affects the arguments advanced by OG, ultimately meaning that OG still has some margin to win, and you should assess that. The fact that the arguments were contested by OO does not mean that they effectively were won by OO. You still have to assess what's the relevance of the consequences that still stand in OG, even though they are to some extent mitigated by OO's claim. Question number 14. CG can place over OG even if government whip spent all of their time summing up OG's case. This is true because government whip can sum up OG's case, but that doesn't mean that that government member did not advance enough material to win over OG. You have to assess the material you effectively have. Even if government whip takes most of their case summing up or most of the speech summing up OG's case, this does not mean that the arguments advanced by the team are not in and of themselves enough to win over OG. As we already covered up, there is no need for a closing team to weigh themselves over an opening team to win the debate. Question number 15 is argumentation that includes highly specialized knowledge should be largely discounted, as highly specialized knowledge makes it difficult for other teams to follow the analysis provided. This is false. Once again, you should assess arguments and evaluate them for their persuasiveness and their likelihood in the debate, not the fact that they are easy or harder to respond or easy or harder to understand. If you understand them, you should give them credit for, and therefore this does not mean that you should discredit the specialized knowledge because it is just difficult to understand or to respond. Question number 16. If opening opposition does not respond to an argument by opening government, then opening opposition loses to opening government, but still can beat other teams in the debate. The answer to this question is false, because as I have already said, judging a debate is not about summing or subtracting arguments and rebuttal, but whereas understanding what arguments are relevant and how do they play out in the debate, even if an argument was not responded, that argument may be irrelevant in the debate and therefore should not mean that a team ultimately just wins because the argument was not contested. You have to assess what's the impact that that argument is making in the round and what is the bottom line that it's proving within the debate. Question number 17. In a debate, both sides of the House, for example, both government and opposition, strive to prove that the world will be better on their side. Therefore, opposition has to give a counter plan or a plan to fix the problem the debate is about. The answer of this question is false. Opening opposition can advance a case in which the world will be better without the policy that OG is advancing in the debate, which ultimately means that opposition is not bound to provide a counterprop. but they can prove that the status quo is better for the world than the policy that OG is trying to advance, or CG, to whatever case. Question number 18. If teams disagree on the interpretation of the motion, judges should default to the interpretation of whichever team spoke first. The answer to this question is false. Judges should evaluate which interpretation was better proven in the debate, was better characterized, and was better substantiated in the debate. They should not just refer to which interpretation was said first. Question number 19 is, when assigning speaker scores, judges should not take into account the team points bracket of the room they are judging. True, as we already covered, judges should guide themselves by the speaker's score scale and the content of the speech they're evaluating, not the fact of how many points has the team, or if the team made an easy case or a difficult case, but whereas evaluating the content, the arguments, and the rebuttal that the team is that the speaker is making in their speech. Question number 20 is, a team that runs an argument that you consider to be offensive in some way, for example, racist, sexist, homophobic, etc., should be penalized with lower team or speaker scores. We already went through these. You should just take into account the content, how that content is persuasive or not persuasive in the debate, but you should not be penalizing teams for this. But likely these kind of arguments that are racist, sexist, or homophobic are likely not going to be persuasive, which means you're already taking that into account, and therefore you should not penalize teams about it. Question number 21. Arguments cannot be persuasive just because the speaker has a good style. Rather, style and analysis must work together to make an argument persuasive. This is true. I think this is self-explanatory. The way in which you analyze arguments is through how persuasive and how likely they are and how relevant they are in the debate. Know how well delivered were they within the debate. Question number 22 is, in motions that start with "this house regrets X," teams need to analyze how the alternative world would have developed without X occurring. So this answer is true. In fact, teams should analyze a counterfactual, which ultimately means that teams need to explain how the world would happen if that thing they are regretting would not have happened, and should be evaluated upon those.
Up to the scenario questions. Question number 1. What is in the responsibility of the panel? Giving speaker scores, providing judging scores on panelists if you are a chair and are the chair if you're a panelist, giving personal feedback to teams if they ask for it. Granted, we ended up deciding not to make this a penalty answer because it wasn't explicitly mentioned in the manual, but we put it as part of our policy that we expect all speakers, all judges, to have the responsibility to give personal feedback when they are asked for it. When a chair is outvoted, both options are correct, that if they choose to give the oral adjudication themselves and explain the call and why they were wrong, it is fine, but they are also allowed to compel a panelist to give the oral adjudication if they do not feel comfortable justifying a call they do not agree with. What is not in the panel's responsibilities? Where the majority of the panel disagrees with the chair and the ranking, the chair, being the most experienced judge on the panel, does not still determine the results of the round. The chair has many responsibilities that allow them to direct the discussion and control a lot of how the result ends up being, but if by the end of the discussion the panel is not convinced, the chair can be rolled. The majority vote will be the determining one. A trainee panelist's vote is not considered for determining the ranking of teams in a round. It is not correct that a chair can promote a trainee to a panelist and give them the power to vote. The only ones who can do this are the CAs. Similarly, a panelist's vote is always considered in determining the rankings of teams in the round. It is not correct that a chair can demote a panelist into a trainee if they believe that they deserve to be. They can give us feedback on that, and again, the CAs can do that, but no chair can do it during the round. Question number 2. In the motion, this House believes that the West should heavily disincentivize cooperation and trade with China. OG defines the motion as imposing additional tariffs on trade with China and higher taxes on companies that operate in China, as well as banning exports in some important industries like technology and telecommunication. OO challenges this and claims that the burden on the government side is to defend sanctioning every country that collaborates and trades with China, or what is referred to as secondary sanctions. Which of the following statements is true? It is true that OG has a legitimate interpretation of the motion. It is not true that OG's interpretation is only legitimate if the DPM defends the definition and responds to the challenge. A challenge does not automatically stand unless it is refuted. If the challenge is unreasonable and the definition is legitimate, it can stand even if the DPM did not end up defending it. On the motion, this House would nationalize pornography. LO says all the problems that OG have identified can be solved by regulating pornography rather than nationalizing it. After that sentence, LO proceeds to mention several harms which are associated with nationalizing pornography. DPM responds by saying the regulation claim presented by the LO is unreasonable, since regulating pornography can mean pretty much anything. The opposition doesn't really provide a substantiated explanation on which types of regulation they deem superior to our model, thus the comparative of the debate does not alter, and we should compare nationalism versus the status quo. DPM then proceeds to prove why the nationalization of pornography is preferable to the status quo. DLO says they disagree and simply repeats the same sentence said by the DLO. It is correct that the DPM is right. An argument about alternatives that is not analyzed, just like any other argument, should not be credited farther than the amount of analysis that was actually provided for it. This means that this line of argumentation is unpersuasive and we shouldn't alter the comparison of the debate. The LO is potentially presenting an alternative to the policy. Unlike counter-prop alternatives, do not automatically alter the comparative in the debate, meaning if the LO were to counter-prop and the counter-prop would be deemed legitimate, we would immediately be able to say that the comparison in the debate shifts. In that case, though, for it to be legitimate, they would need to substantiate and explain much more what they mean by this counter-prop. On the motion, this House would legalize euthanasia. OG doesn't provide any mechanism and give generic analysis on why the legalization of euthanasia would be a good thing. OO gives reasons why these decisions will be made in highly irrational and emotionally charged states and that the policy will lead to deaths that could have been prevented. MG responds to OO by saying that many of the concerns could be addressed by, or at least significantly mitigated by policies such as requiring patients to talk to a psychiatrist, imposing a waiting period between a person's decision and when they are euthanized, and by using painless medical technology. Member of government says that they are making reasonable assumptions about how the policy would be implemented based on standard procedures used by most countries that have legalized euthanasia. They then provide new arguments in favor of legalization. Member of OP says it is illegitimate for CG to add new points of mechanism and judges should ignore the mechanisms that member of government added. After this, they proceed to talk about why this will be a very painful experience as the technology used is not advanced enough. It is correct that CG is discussing a reasonably sensible version of the policy, which OO should have anticipated, and hence it should be taken into account in this comparison. It is true that closing teams do not have the fiat to give a model in a debate. However, they are allowed to give characterization on how a model is likely to look like in real life if such a model doesn't exist in top half, especially when it is a very predictable one with the basic logic that teams have a fair chance to engage it because they could expect it. It is, however, not correct that you should ignore the mechanism part, but CG can still place above other teams if you think the added material for legalization is better than the other teams when you exclude the new mechanism. I think the reason why this wrong answer was popular is because if you ignore the first part of the sentence, it is true that even if CG's illegitimate material is illegitimate, you should still credit the rest of the material. However, this answer was still accepted as wrong because the first part is wrong. You shouldn't ignore the new mechanism. It is a valuable part of the debate and a legitimate one at that. 5. On the motion, this House believes that former colonial powers should drastically increase the number of immigrants they accept from their ex-colonies. OG proves that former colonial powers have a moral obligation to help the people they oppressed. OO proves via rebuttal that the policy will not help former colonies. OO further proves that there is a moral obligation of former colonial powers to the citizens that live in their country currently, and that this policy harms those citizens. OG concedes that former colonies have a moral obligation to their current citizens and that the policy harms those existing citizens, but proves that the moral obligation to former colonies is greater. It is correct that OG loses to OO because the relevance of OG's principle is conditional on the policy helping former colonies, which OO successfully rebuts. It is not true that OG loses to OO because they concede OO's material on the moral obligation to current citizens. It is possible to concede a moral obligation claim and still win it by outweighing a competing case. It is also not true that OO loses to OG because despite proving that it won't work in the rebuttal, their positive material defends the more privileged group, which is comparatively less important than OG's material. It could be a weighing that could, in some circumstances, be accepted. However, given that OG's material is contingent on proving efficacy, then you cannot weigh the more important group being impacted by something that doesn't happen. Question 6. You are winging in round 6. The chair begins the discussion by asking for initial calls and then calls on a different panelist to compare OG and OO. You are convinced that the most important comparison is between OG and CO and become increasingly worried that there won't be enough time to explore the comparison properly. It is the correct answer that you wait until the discussion comes around to OG and CO and ask to explain your position. If you feel that the chair has mishandled the discussion, give detailed feedback to the CA team after the debate. So to be clear, it is always the chair's responsibility to manage the panel and exclusively the chair's responsibility, and you are not supposed to try and take it from their hands. If you disagree with how they manage the panel, reflect it to the CAs, and that is it. Question 7, points of information. It is correct that if a team does not take a POI, judges can potentially flip a close call or reduce the margin of victory of the team that failed to take a POI. It is also correct that if a speaker doesn't take a POI in their speech, upon the speech being done, the chair judge should remind the room that speakers are expected to take POIs. Failure to take a POI indicates a reduced level of engagement, and that is why judges should reduce the speaker score of a speaker who does not take any POIs. We did not mark this as right or wrong per se. It is something that judges have the option to do. Based on what happens in the round, judges can properly assess the degree of lack of taking POIs impact on engagement to an extent that impacts speaker scores in a way that also reflects the rest of what makes sense within the speaker scores, such as you would obviously not give a team lower speaker scores than another team that they win just because they failed to take a POI. It is wrong that failure to take a POI should be seen as equivalent to taking a damaging POI. This would be interventionist. We do not judge based on how we would imagine a devastating POI looking like. Failure to take a POI indicates a reduced level of engagement, but judges should not reduce the speaker score of a speaker who does not take any POIs is again false, because speaker scores are reflecting holistically what happened throughout the debate, including the POIs. There's no reason to ignore them. And it is also false that if CO does not take a POI from the OG, then CO cannot place over OG. It will probably flip close calls, but it is still possible for CO to win over OG. Question 8, on the motion, this House believes that NATO should intervene in Yemen. OO claims that it is impossible because Russia and China will veto the intervention in the UN Security Council. It is correct that government fiat assumes that intervention is possible. That opposition claim should just be ignored during deliberation. It is incorrect that the judge panel should penalize OO for running an argument that ignores the proposition fiat. We just ignore bad arguments. It is unholistic to be penaltive about them. It is very possible that the rest of the OO material is great. We just pretend it never happened, just like we wouldn't credit knives or new material in whip speech. Question 9. On the motion, this House, as parents, would raise their child to prefer to be single. It is true that in this motion, judges should only consider what parents' knowledge, values, and interests are, and not what is necessarily best for the world. This is an actor motion. This is how we judge them. It is also true that the interest of the parent in this motion can be both practical and principled. It is not true that, as we do not have epistemic access to the personal beliefs of parents, judges should also consider the likelihood of parents deciding to raise their child this way. The idea behind these motions and behind actor motions in general isn't a question of are they likely to act the way that the motion suggests, but only is it advisable for them? Is it a good idea or something that they would want to do if you give them advice based on the motion and the interest of the actor at date?